The world of Mesopotamia was restless after the fall of Akkad. The empire of Sargon the Great, once stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, had crumbled under the weight of drought, famine, and endless raids by mountain tribes. The land of rivers, once tightly bound under imperial control, broke apart into fragments of competing city-states. Power shifted from one ruler to another, alliances dissolved as quickly as they were forged, and chaos became the rhythm of life in the plains between the Tigris and Euphrates. Farmers toiled in parched fields, priests struggled to keep the temples alive, and city walls bore the scars of constant sieges. For the people who lived in those times, it felt as though the gods themselves had abandoned them. But out of this disarray, a new force began to stir in the deep south of Sumer, in a city that had been important for centuries, yet had never fully dominated the land. This was a place of moon worship, of merchant caravans that stretched toward the Persian Gulf, and of sailors who knew the routes to Dilmun and Magan. Its people carried within them the memory of Sumer's greatness, and in their stories they remembered the old kings who had once united the land. From the ruins of Akkad, rose, not merely as another city-state seeking power, but as a dynasty with the ambition to bring order to the fractured world. The dawn of the Empire began with one man whose vision was larger than his lifetime. His name was Ur-Nammu, a king who would carve his place not only into the clay tablets of scribes, but also into the very foundations of Mesopotamian history. When he first came to power around 2112 BC, Sumer was battered by decades of instability. The Gutians, fierce highland tribes who had swept down from the Zagros Mountains, still lurked in the memory of the people as the destroyers of order, accused by later scribes of plunging Mesopotamia into a dark age. Yet it was precisely this legacy of chaos that made Ur-Nammu's achievement all the more striking. He seized the throne at a time when power lay scattered, and he set about not just conquering but rebuilding. For Ur-Nammu was not remembered simply as a warrior, though he commanded armies. He was remembered as a builder, a legislator, a man who restored the balance between gods and mortals. His greatest monument still rises from the dust today, the ziggurat of Ur, a towering pyramid of mud brick that reached toward the heavens in honor of the moon god Nana. It was not merely a temple but a statement of ambition. In its massive tiers, rising step by step, lay a vision of a world brought back into order, tiered and structured, each level resting upon the strength of the one below. The ziggurat was the centerpiece of Ur's new identity, a symbol visible for miles across the flat plains, reminding farmer and merchant alike of the might of their city. But Ur-Nammu's ambition extended beyond bricks and temples. He gave Sumer its first great legal code, a system of justice inscribed in cuneiform, long before Hammurabi of Babylon would write his more famous laws. Ur-Nammu's code did not simply prescribe harsh punishments. It sought to protect the weak from the strong, to guarantee fairness in trade, to ensure that the widow and the orphan had recourse against exploitation. This vision of order was as much divine as it was practical, for in Sumer, the king was the shepherd chosen by the gods, responsible for maintaining justice as a cosmic duty. Yet behind this order lay the constant hum of danger. To the east, Elamite raiders watched with envy from the mountains of modern-day Iran. To the north, rival city-states tested Ur's strength, uncertain whether its rise would be permanent or fleeting. Ur-Nammu's armies marched to secure the fertile plains and the trade routes, bringing back under control the lands once ruled by Akkad. Each victory was not just military but symbolic, the rebirth of Sumer under Ur's banner. And still, the daily life of Ur's citizens thrived under this resurgence. Along the banks of the Euphrates, canals carried water to irrigate barley fields. Merchants filled the streets, their goods laid out in markets where lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from Oman, and timber from Lebanon could be found side by side. Scribes recorded transactions on clay tablets, Officials kept track of harvests, and priests led rituals in towering temples, ensuring the gods were appeased. To live in Ur at this time was to feel that the world was once again secure, that the chaos of the Gutian age had passed, and that Sumer had entered a golden age under a dynasty destined to last. But as history often reminds us, no golden age is without its shadows. Ur-Nammu's reign, though celebrated, was not eternal. His life ended violently, likely on the battlefield, struck down during a campaign against northern enemies. His death was sudden, and the stability he had built seemed momentarily fragile. Yet in his place rose his son, Shulgi, a man whose ambition and genius would transform Ur into not just a city, not just a kingdom, but a true empire. Shulgi would take the foundations his father laid and build upon them, a system so intricate, so advanced, that some scholars call the Ur the Three Dynasty, the first real bureaucratic state in history. Thus, the age of Ur-Nammu closed with both triumph and tragedy, leaving behind monuments of stone and laws of clay. But also the question of whether his legacy would endure. That answer would come in the reign of Shulgi, who would reign for nearly half a century and whose story would carry Ur into the heights of power, weaving glory with contradictions, splendor with ruthlessness. The stage was set for the true flowering of the Ur Empire, a moment in history when Sumer stood once again as the heart of Mesopotamia, before fate and invasion would sweep it away into memory. Shulgi ascended the throne, not as an untested youth, but as the heir of a vision already in motion. He inherited from his father, Ur-Nammu, not only the throne of Ur, but the fragile dream of unity in a land scarred by centuries of rivalry. The clay tablets of his time would remember him as a man of extraordinary talents, a king who claimed to be both warrior and scholar, both athlete and poet. In Shulgi, the Ur dynasty found its most remarkable ruler, a figure who embodied the energy and ambition of a reborn Sumer. His reign would stretch for nearly half a century, long enough to carve his image deeply into the fabric of Mesopotamian history. In the early years, his first task was to secure what his father had left behind. Ur's hold on Sumer was still precarious, its enemies circling like vultures, ready to seize advantage of any weakness. Shulgi moved swiftly, demonstrating his strength on the battlefield. Campaign after campaign extended the borders of Ur's influence not merely to dominate the city-states of southern Mesopotamia, but to press outward into the north and east, where Elamite raiders and rival powers threatened the fragile unity of the land. Each victory was celebrated with hymns that praised him as the beloved of the gods, chosen to carry the destiny of Sumer forward. Yet Shulgi's genius lay not only in war, but in organization. He understood that conquest without control would collapse into the same disorder that had undone Akkad. And so he turned his attention inward to the mechanisms of governance. What emerged under his reign was a level of bureaucracy unmatched in Mesopotamian history up to that point. Thousands of clay tablets survive from his administration, etched with cuneiform lines detailing every aspect of life. Harvest quotas, labor assignments, temple offerings, tax obligations, and trade receipts. Nothing was left to chance, and nothing was left unrecorded. The empire became a machine of paperwork, its heart beating in the scribal schools where young men learned the art of writing, not only to glorify the gods, but to keep track of grain, livestock, and the movement of soldiers. Shulgi created a network of governors, each loyal to him, each responsible for ensuring that their provinces met the quotas demanded by the central authority. It was a system built on precision, one that gave the Ur Empire the ability to feed its armies, build its monuments, and sustain its vast population with a degree of stability that few ancient states could rival. At the center of this system stood Shulgi himself, not only as king, but as a figure who claimed divinity. Unlike his father, who ruled as the chosen of the gods, Shulgi went further. He proclaimed himself divine during his lifetime, allowing hymns to be composed in his honor, celebrating him as a god among men. The audacity of this claim reveals both his ambition and his understanding of power. By elevating himself above the realm of mortal kingship, he placed his authority beyond question, fusing politics with religion so tightly that to obey Shulgi was to obey the divine will itself. But the divinity he claimed was not distant. He cultivated an image of himself as a king who excelled in every human endeavor. Stories tell of his athletic feats, of how he could run from Nippur to Ur in a single day, a journey of over 100 miles, without faltering. He was celebrated as a poet, composing hymns that praised his reign and described his accomplishments in eloquent verse. He even styled himself as a wise judge, echoing the legacy of his father's law code, but with greater emphasis on his own personal wisdom. Whether all these tales were literal truth or carefully crafted propaganda, they created a portrait of a king who was more than human, a ruler whose talents extended into every realm of existence. Yet beneath this golden image lay a more complex reality. The bureaucracy that made the empire strong also demanded relentless labor from its people. Workers were conscripted to dig canals, build temples, and cultivate fields for the benefit of the state. The efficiency of Shulgi's system left little room for resistance, and those who failed to meet their quotas faced punishment. The hymns may have praised him as a benevolent shepherd, but the daily grind of ordinary laborers told another story, one of obligation, toil, and the weight of imperial demands. Even so, the prosperity of the Ur Empire under Shulgi was undeniable. Temples rose across the land, ziggurats towering above cities as symbols of both piety and power. The wealth of trade flowed through Ur's streets, bringing goods from distant lands, gold from Anatolia, silver from Iran, precious stones from Afghanistan, and exotic woods from India. Merchants sailed the waters of the Gulf, their ships heavy with cargo destined for Ur's bustling markets. The empire was not only a political power, but an economic hub, a magnet for the wealth of the ancient world. Religion, too, flourished under Shulgi's reign. He rebuilt temples across the land, ensuring that each city felt included in the sacred order of the empire. By honoring the gods of many cities while centering devotion on Ur's moon god Nana, he created both unity and hierarchy, binding local traditions to the authority of his dynasty. Priests worked hand in hand with scribes and governors, ensuring that the gods received their offerings just as the state received its taxes. The spiritual and the political became two faces of the same system, each reinforcing the other. But no empire, however grand, was free from shadows. Shulgi's declaration of divinity, while strengthening his authority, also sowed seeds of tension. To claim godhood was to invite envy, skepticism, and eventual backlash. His relentless campaigns strained the empire's resources, and his bureaucratic system, though efficient, was also brittle, vulnerable to corruption and overextension. The very precision that gave the empire strength could become a weakness when disrupted. Shulgi's reign stretched on for decades, and with each passing year his legend grew. By the time of his death, he had transformed the vision of his father into a living reality. An empire that reached across Mesopotamia, united by law, sustained by bureaucracy, enriched by trade, and exalted by religion. Under his rule, the Ur Empire stood as the most powerful state in the ancient Near East, a beacon of Sumerian revival after centuries of chaos. Yet history is a river that never rests. Even as Shulgi's achievements seemed unshakable, currents of change began to stir at the edges of his empire. His successors would inherit both the glory he built and the burdens he left behind. The system that functioned so perfectly under his guiding hand would prove more difficult to sustain in weaker hands. The enemies that Shulgi had beaten back would bide their time, waiting for the moment when the empire's defenses weakened. For now, though, as Shulgi's reign closed, Ur shone like a jewel in the desert. Its ziggurat towered above the plains, its temples hummed with prayer. Its markets thrived with the wealth of distant lands, and its people lived in the confidence that they were part of a civilization favored by the gods. It was a time when Sumer stood tall once more, a final golden age before the shadows lengthened. The legacy of Shulgi was both triumph and hubris, prosperity and burden, a legacy that would test his heirs in the years to come. And so the story moved forward, from the divine king to his successors, men who would inherit not only the throne of Ur, but the fragile weight of empire. In their hands lay the fate of Sumer's last great dynasty, a fate that would be shaped by both human ambition and the relentless tides of history. When Shulgi's long reign finally ended, the empire he left behind was strong in appearance, yet already weighed down by its own size and complexity. The great king had woven together a state of extraordinary precision, but like a tapestry stretched too tightly on its frame, it was prone to tearing. Into this inheritance stepped his sons and grandsons, men who bore the title of king, but lacked the charisma and towering presence of the divine Shulgi. The weight of his legacy was both a gift and a curse. For while they ruled a vast and prosperous land, they also bore the responsibility of maintaining a system that demanded constant vigilance. The first to inherit the throne after Shulgi was Amar-Sin, a ruler determined to carry on the glory of his father. His reign was marked by great building projects and the continuation of campaigns into the surrounding regions. He sought to project the image of strength, ensuring that the empire did not appear to falter after the death of its greatest king. Amar-Sin commissioned temples, restored canals, and maintained the bureaucratic machinery that kept the empire's fields fertile and its storehouses full. Yet even in his time, cracks began to show. The enemies who had feared Shulgi's name were quick to test his son. The Elamites, ever restless in their mountain strongholds to the east, pressed against the borders, raiding and probing for weakness. The Amorites, semi-nomadic tribes from the western deserts, moved steadily into Mesopotamia, drawn by the wealth and fertility of the land. Their encroachment was gradual, but their presence was felt in the countryside, where they strained the empire's resources and challenged its ability to control the open plains. Amar-Sin fought to hold them back, but the very act of defense drained the empire's strength, consuming soldiers, supplies, and attention that might have otherwise been turned inward to reform and repair. Still, the empire endured, and Amar-Sin's reign, though shorter than his father's, kept Ur's light burning. He was succeeded by Shusin, who faced even greater challenges. Shusin's reign is remembered for both continuity and innovation, as he sought to manage the growing pressures that threatened to overwhelm the state. Perhaps most famously, he constructed a massive defensive wall in the north, a barrier stretching for miles across the land, designed to keep the Amorite tribes at bay. Known in later texts as the Wall to keep out the Martu, it was one of the earliest attempts at a large-scale defensive structure in history, echoing the impulse that would later give rise to fortifications in many civilizations. Yet walls are only as strong as the will and resources behind them. The Amorites, far from being deterred, simply found ways around the barrier, or else seeped slowly through it, settling within Mesopotamia itself. Walls could not stop migration, and the empire Engi, dependence on vast networks of agriculture and trade, meant that its strength could not simply be defended with fortifications. Shusin's efforts were admirable, but they revealed the empire's growing desperation, a recognition that the threats it faced were no longer easily managed. Even as the empire strained against these pressures, its inner life continued with a semblance of prosperity. Temples still rose, rituals still bound the people to their gods, and scribes still filled clay tablets with the daily records of an empire. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. The bureaucracy that Shulgi had perfected became increasingly heavy, its demands on the population growing harsher as resources dwindled. Farmers bore the brunt of the burden, their harvests taken in greater measure to feed armies and sustain the lavish rituals of the temples. Laborers were pressed into service for longer and longer stretches, digging canals or working on construction projects that no longer inspired awe, but resentment. The machine of the state was still functioning, but it was grinding down the very people on whose labor it depended. Shu-Sin's reign gave way to Ibi-Sin, the last king of the Ur dynasty, and with him the empire's decline accelerated. Ibi-Sin inherited a state already stretched thin, its defenses strained, its bureaucracy brittle, and its enemies emboldened. His reign, lasting over 2 decades, was a long struggle against forces that were slipping out of his control. The Amorites pressed deeper into Mesopotamia, settling in the countryside, undermining Ur's control of its own heartland. The Elamites, seeing opportunity in the empire's weakness, launched raids that struck at the very core of Sumer. Clay tablets from this period record the growing desperation of the empire. Famines struck the land, worsened by climate change and overuse of the soil. Drought reduced harvests, while floods destroyed what little could be salvaged. With food scarce, the population grew restless, and rebellions flared in the provinces. Governors who once had been loyal began to act more independently, hoarding resources for their own survival rather than sending them to Ur. The tightly woven fabric of the empire began to unravel. Thread by thread, Ibi-Sin struggled valiantly against this tide. He sent out armies, he fortified cities, he prayed to the gods for deliverance. In letters preserved on clay tablets, he implored his officials to remain loyal, to provide supplies, to hold the line against the invaders. But his pleas revealed not confidence, but fear. The voice of a king who felt the ground slipping beneath his feet. The once mighty Ur Empire, which under Shulgi had seemed unshakable, now trembled on the brink of collapse. The final blow came from the east. The Elamites, long-standing rivals, launched a devastating invasion that pierced through the weakened defenses. They struck at Ur itself, breaching its walls and reducing the great city to ruins. The ziggurat, once the proud symbol of Ur-Nammu's vision, stood amidst devastation. The temples were plundered, the treasury looted, and the people carried into captivity. Ibi-Sin himself was taken prisoner, dragged away into exile in Elam, a broken king whose name would forever mark the end of Sumer's last great empire. The fall of Ur around 2004 BC was more than the collapse of a dynasty. It marked the end of the Sumerian age, the final chapter in a civilization that had given the world writing, monumental architecture, organized religion, and the first experiments in kingship and law. After Ur, the stage of Mesopotamia would belong to new powers, the Amorite dynasties that rose in Babylon and elsewhere, carrying forward the legacy of Sumer even as they reshaped it into something new. Yet the memory of Ur did not vanish. The hymns and laments composed in the aftermath of its fall echoed through Mesopotamian culture for centuries. The lament for Ur speaks of the city's destruction in haunting tones, describing how the gods abandoned their temples, how the walls fell, how the people wept as they were led away. These laments became part of the cultural memory, a reminder that even the mightiest empires could fall when the favor of the gods was lost. In the voice of these ancient poets, one hears not only grief, but a profound reflection on the fragility of human achievement. And so the story of Ur closed not with triumph, but with tragedy. The empire that had risen from the chaos after Akkad, that had restored Sumer's greatness under Ur-Nammu and Shulgi, ended in flames and exile. Yet its legacy lived on, in the laws that influenced later codes, in the administrative systems that shaped future empires, and in the myths that continued to inspire awe. Ur was forgotten by many, overshadowed by the fame of Babylon and Assyria, but for those who dig into the deep layers of Mesopotamian history, it remains a cornerstone, a civilization that reached for the divine and left behind monuments that still rise from the dust. From the ashes of Ur, new powers would emerge. The Amorites would found the kingdom of Babylon, whose most famous king, Hammurabi, would inscribe laws on stone that echoed Ur-Nammu's vision centuries before. The Elamites, who brought Ur low, would in time be overshadowed themselves. Mesopotamia remained a land of rising and falling powers, its soil fertile not only for crops, but for empires. Ur was but one among them, but it was the last that bore the true name of Sumer. Its fall was the end of an age, the twilight of the first civilization humanity ever built. The fall of Ur was not only a political disaster, but the collapse of a way of life that had flourished for centuries. To understand what was lost, one must step into the streets of Ur in its prime, to breathe the air of its markets, to hear the songs of its poets, to watch the rituals unfold in its temples. For while kings and armies dominate the chronicles, it was the daily rhythm of the people that gave the empire its true vitality. The city of Ur, nestled on the banks of the Euphrates, was a marvel of its age. Canals cut through the land like veins, bringing water to fields of barley that stretched beyond the horizon. Herds of sheep and goats grazed under the watchful eyes of herders, their wool destined for workshops where spinners and weavers produced fine textiles that were shipped across the ancient world. The economy of Ur was both agricultural and mercantile, a balance between the stability of the fields and the dynamism of trade. In the heart of the city rose the ziggurat, its massive steps ascending toward the heavens. To climb it was to ascend from the realm of men to the realm of the gods, each tier lifting the worshipper closer to the divine. At its summit, the temple of Nanna, the moon god, presided over the city. Priests tended to the god's needs as if he were a living king, offering food, drink, and incense in daily rituals. Festivals brought the population together in celebration, processions filling the streets with music, dance, and devotion. Religion was not a separate sphere, but the very fabric of existence, binding the people of Ur to one another and to the unseen powers they believed governed their fate. Inside the houses of Ur, life was varied and complex. Wealthy merchants lived in multi-room homes built of mud brick, with courtyards where families gathered in the evening. Servants and slaves performed the labor that sustained these households, from grinding grain to carrying water from the canals. In humbler dwellings, families crowded into small rooms, their lives bound to the rhythms of work in the fields or workshops. Children learned their trades from their parents, but for a chosen few, the path led to the scribal schools, where they would master the art of cuneiform. The scribes were the silent backbone of the empire. Sitting cross-legged with clay tablets on their laps, they impressed wedge-shaped signs with their reed styluses, recording everything from royal decrees to the rations given to workers. Through their work, the bureaucracy of Ur functioned with remarkable precision. Yet, the scribes were not only administrators, they were also poets and chroniclers. They composed hymns in praise of kings and gods, epics that told of heroes and battles, laments that mourned the loss of cities. It is through their tablets that the voice of Ur still speaks across the millennia, whispering to us of a world long gone. Among the most haunting of these texts are the laments for Ur's fall. They describe how the gods abandoned the city, how the once bustling streets fell silent, how mothers wept as their children were led away in chains. In their poetry, the destruction of Ur was not merely the work of human enemies, but the judgment of the divine. The gods had turned their backs, and without their protection, the city was doomed. These laments were recited for generations, ensuring that the memory of Ur's destruction remained alive, not only as history, but as theology, a warning that even the greatest city could fall if it lost the favor of heaven. Yet for all its tragedy, the legacy of the Ur Empire was immense. It represented the final flowering of Sumerian civilization, the last great expression of a culture that had pioneered so much. The legal code of Ur-Nammu set the stage for later systems of justice, most famously the laws of Hammurabi. The administrative structures refined under Shulgi influenced the bureaucracies of Babylon, Assyria, and beyond. The ziggurats that dotted Mesopotamia became the archetype of sacred architecture, inspiring later traditions with their vision of a stairway between heaven and earth. Even in religion, Ur left its mark. The moon god Nana remained a powerful figure in Mesopotamian worship, and the rituals perfected in his temple at Ur influenced the cultic practices of later empires. The hymns composed for the kings of Ur, blending politics and piety, became a model for how rulers across the Near East would justify their authority. In this way, the spirit of Ur outlived its ruins, carried forward in the institutions, laws, and traditions of the civilizations that followed. And what of the people themselves, those who lived through its rise and fall? Their names are scattered across tablets. Farmers who delivered grain, shepherds who counted their flocks, craftsmen who worked in the shadow of the ziggurat. Their lives may seem distant, but their concerns were familiar. Feeding their families, finding security, seeking the favor of their gods. In their voices, recorded by the scribes, we hear not only the story of an empire, but the story of humanity, its eternal struggle to build, to flourish, and to endure against the tides of time. The Ur Empire's end was not the end of Mesopotamia. New powers rose in its place, most famously the Amorite dynasty of Babylon, whose kings carried forward the torch of empire. Hammurabi's code, inscribed on stone centuries after Ur-Nammu, echoed the principles of justice first laid out in Ur. The Assyrians, in their turn, inherited the bureaucratic genius of Shulgi's administration, and even the exiles who wept by the rivers of Babylon in later centuries may have found in the laments of Ur an echo of their own sorrow, a reminder that they were not the first people to lose their city to the fury of conquest. To tell the story of Ur is to tell the story of both greatness and fragility. It is to witness a people who, in the aftermath of Akkad's collapse, dared to dream of unity once more, who built temples that touched the sky, who wrote laws to govern with justice, who sang hymns to kings that became gods. It is also to witness the inevitability of decline, the relentless forces of famine, invasion, and rebellion that no empire can withstand forever. Ur was forgotten by many, overshadowed by the fame of Babylon and Assyria, but its place in history is undeniable. It was the last true empire of Sumer, the final chapter in the world's first civilization. Today, its ruins still rise from the dust of Iraq, its ziggurat partially restored, a silent witness to the passage of 4,000 years. To stand before it is to feel both the power and the impermanence of human endeavor. Once it was the heart of a mighty empire. Now it is a monument to memory, a reminder that all empires, no matter how glorious, are but brief flames in the long night of history. The Ur Empire has been called forgotten, but it is not lost. Its story survives in clay and stone, in laments and hymns, in the very idea of empire that it helped shape. And though its fall marked the end of Sumer's long journey, its spirit lived on in the civilizations that followed, echoing across the centuries, reminding us that from dust we rise and to dust we return, yet in the dust we leave our stories, waiting to be rediscovered. And so the saga of Ur closes, not with silence, but with a voice carried across millennia, a voice that speaks of ambition and devotion, of triumph and tragedy, of a people who reached for the heavens and left their mark upon the earth. The forgotten empire of Mesopotamia is forgotten no longer, for its ruins still whisper, its hymns still resonate, and its memory still shapes the way we understand the rise and fall of all who came after.